Hi, we are here with Dr. Christine, who is a social justice advocate, a survivor, and a protective mom. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, Christine, we would love to talk about the kind of amazing work that you are doing in the realm of coercive control, and also a little bit about the differences between coercive control and emotional abuse and narcissism in general.
Absolutely. So what I would say is that narcissism is something that we call a lot of people, we say, oh, he's a narcissist or she's a narcissist. But what we know is that not all narcissists are coercive controllers.
Right.
The people that I work with, all coercive controllers have narcissistic tendencies, narcissistic personality traits, but the significant traits. So I think going back to the word narcissism, there's a lot of nuance there. People can be a low-level narcissist, annoying, acting immature, or people can be moderate, or people can be really significantly characterologically disordered. I tend to work with the people who are with the victims of people who are significantly characterologically disordered. And in that, what they are human beings who do have malicious intent.
Right.
Their intent is to coerce and control others. So the word coercive control was propelled by Dr. Evan Stark, who I was fortunate to work under for my doctorate work. And he propelled the term because he truly believed that there is a group of people who are willing to harm others, to coerce and control others. And in that, it happens in intimate relationships. Yeah. He saw it as something that is a gendered oppression, meaning that it's based on patriarchal norms.
Yeah.
So what are we saying here? We're saying that people who have power and control are willing to exert this power and control over individuals or groups of people. And they do so by using people's vulnerabilities against them. So who's the most vulnerable in our population?
Yeah.
Women,
yeah.
And children.
Yeah.
And so his idea was that this is something that doesn't just happen in the relationship. It actually can occur outside of it. And the term is really comes from Biderman's research, the coercion chart that he created during the Korean War, that really demonstrates how prisoners of war could easily be manipulated. He called it stress manipulation tactics to either acquiesce or align with their oppressors. So what do we know about victims and survivors? That oftentimes they become so small in the relationship that they are able to almost take on the belief system, the false narrative of the abuser. They begin thinking they are crazy, that there's something wrong with them, that they need to do more, that if they only did this, then their abuser would not be upset. And what abusers do, what coercive controllers do, call them what you may, I call them perpetrators, coercive controllers, some people call them narcissistic abusers, is what they do is they capitalize on that. So I always say that victims are perfect prey because victims are not, there's nothing wrong with them. They actually are pretty amazing human beings. They are givers. They are loyal to a fault. They want things to work out. They work really, really hard. And in that, the coercive controller will continue to take more.
Yeah.
Will capitalize on that. So what I would say is that we know that when this happens in a relationship, it is intimate terrorism, that people are trapped, that it's really challenging to leave because there's always this knowledge that if they leave, things will get worse. And everyone, of course, is most worried if they have children, what will happen with their relationship with the children. But I just want to expand for a moment. I see this as something that happens in the micro level, as Dr. Stark did in intimate relationships, but I actually see that it crosses all spheres. And that is in the meso system, we see it happening in courts. We see it happening in child welfare agencies. We see even domestic abuse advocates minimizing the experiences of victims, trying hard to accommodate abusers so that they cooperate. We see therapists. I am a therapist. Therapists will gaslight clients into believing that the situation maybe isn't as bad as they think it is, or they will diagnose, pathologize victims as having anxiety, depression, or other issues when actually they're being abused. And that is the manifestation of the abuse. And then in the macro system, I see that policies that are implemented actually harm victims and survivors, and that the governments that implement these policies are complicit in these policies that are harmful. So I like to expand it that coercive control is the foundation, the underpinning of all abuse.
Yeah.
Every single harm that is inflicted onto humans, including genocide, including any ism, racism, sexism, including things like sex trafficking, child predators. Not all child predators are, not all coercive controllers are child predators, but all child predators use the same exact grooming techniques that Biderman saw in the Korean War, and that perpetrators of intimate partner violence use.
Yeah. Dr. Christine, I guess I wonder what factors would make a person have such abusive tendencies, and again, as a victim or someone who's experiencing a coercive controller, what factors would be present for that victim?
Sure. So these abusers want to strip away a victim's agency, their autonomy. And what that means is that as a victim, you may begin to lose your voice in the relationship. You will not be able to express how you feel. A lot of people call it walking on eggshells, right? So that occurs. But what these abusers' traits are and where they come from.
Yeah.
Oftentimes what we know is, and there's a Harvard study that has affirmed this, is that children are born a little more ego compromised. What that means is they just might be a little more vulnerable due to DNA, due to genetics, due to epigenetics, intergenerational trauma, right? Things that are passed down. The knowledge we have now about epigenetics is really profound, right? Or they're born more ego resilient. So ask yourself, when you think about people that you know who maybe came from a challenging childhood, but they overcame those obstacles and they are doing absolutely fine. They're not manifesting their trauma in their daily lives. Those people probably, it's not black and white, but probably were born more ego resilient. They came into the world a little more, for lack of a better word, hardy, and they were able to overcome obstacles. Some people call these people like I guess I would call them people who are, again, just resilient, right? And so with a coercive controller, I think it's kind of safe to assume that they probably were born a little more ego compromised. Like maybe I was, who knows, right? And then in that, they were born into a family system where they did not receive from one primary caretaker unconditional love and the ability to be authentic. Now, Gabor Mate talks about this. And his work is just so profound. But what we know is that when children do not grow up in family systems where they're receiving this, again, from one primary caretaker, they grow up with shame.
Yeah.
And what does that shame look like? It looks like I'm going to hide who I really am. I'm going to regulate my behavior around the people that are supposed to love me implicitly and unconditionally. I can't be my true self. I cannot be accepted for who I am. Now, if that develops over time and it's never remedied, ever remedied, then in that child has grown up with this need to cover themselves. And in that, the only way to feel okay, to feel safe, is to control my world. So I believe that narcissists come from this. Now, there's a spectrum in narcissism, again. So some people can function and they can actually have relatively decent relationships. They may not be the best person to have a relationship with. That might be the low-level narcissist. Then there's the moderate. Probably not healthy to be with that person. And then there's the people who have been taken in that shame so significantly that in that They are exerting power and control in various aspects of their lives, very covertly, very malignantly, and very harmful. And so just to add a little more to that, which is very important, what I say is that children growing up in a home where they have a protective parent who loves them unconditionally, but they have this coercive controller who sometimes the protective parent doesn't even know is an abuser. So remember that these people are often charlatans. They can even hide it in their own home. And so these children are growing up with thinking that they have they have two protective parents, but one person is covertly diminishing the protective parent or overtly. So now the child has no one to trust. So you see the intergenerational trauma can actually occur in that situation, even with the most well-intentioned protective parent, because these abusers will insidiously undermine the protective parent. And I say that from personal experience, and I say that also as a clinician who has worked with thousands of mothers who have experienced this.
Yeah, wow. But Christine, I know that you do speak about your experience. Can you just say, like, what makes you susceptible, or what factors go into making you blind to not seeing that there is this abuse happening to you and to your kids?
Sure. So I do tell people that I've been doing this work since I was 19. Yeah. And I was a child welfare worker working specifically with domestic abuse. I've been a counselor for sexual assault, domestic violence agency for over 35 years. And I didn't know it was happening to me teaching on the domestic abuse wheel every single semester. So what I would say is that, again, I'm going to go back to the traits of victims. Victims work hard to make things work. They are givers in relationships. And if you are a person who has what I call super traits, you're just kind of a good human, then in that, the abuser is going to be able to lure you in and take advantage of that slowly, over time. It can take a long time. It can take a short time. What's important, and I think what you're talking about, Jasmyn, is understanding red flags, because so many people are never taught what the red flags of an abusive relationship are, or frankly, the green flags in a relationship. What are the aspects that make a relationship healthy? And if we don't go into relationship dynamics knowing that, oh my gosh, we can be entirely hoodwinked by abusers.
Yeah. So, Dr. Christine, you spoke about patriarchy, and in brown culture in South Asia, we experience that. However, when we're looking at, patriarchy I wonder how it plays out in the West as compared to how we experience it here, and how coercive controllers are still present in the West. And pretty, you mentioned that they're very rich, very white women who are experiencing coercive controllers. How does that play out in the social structure?
So I would say that all domestic abuse is foundational in coercive control, which means that whether you're rich or poor, whether you're white or brown, if I am an abuser, I'm going to try to coerce and control you and take advantage of you and capitalize on that. Now, if I am a rich woman, then no one expects me to be a victim of abuse. Yes. Right? And of course, if I'm a white woman, no one expects me.
Which was the conversation we were having earlier. Because one of the things, when I was originally listening to your work, and we don't talk like back home in Pakistan, and I know even here in the UAE with all these talks we've been doing about things like coercive control, is because so many aspects are so normalized. Yeah. It is so culturally common for, let's take a typical example, a husband to say to their wife, you can't work here, or you can't wear that, or such and such activity isn't safe, or I don't think the children should be able to go away to study somewhere. And these are regular aspects of patriarchy. And Sam and I were discussing this earlier, and Sam's like, is this happening to white people too? Because this is normalized for us. Why are they buying into this? Yeah. And so maybe just if you can say a bit about that, but also how do we distinguish between what might be a problematic patriarchal system versus what is then going into a realm of more like insidious abuse.
Right, right. So I would say that in general, all women on the planet are groomed in a way that we adhere to patriarchal norms.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter where you live. It doesn't even matter your religion. So I think in general, part of our biology is to be caretakers.
Yeah.
That's our biology. And then in addition to that, our culture is going to influence that. And culture, of course, is going to be where we live, but also our religion. And then parenting, how we're parented. What are the messages we receive from our parents about how girls should maybe wash the dishes and boys can mow the lawn, right? Something as simple as that. Or girls should not wear that, but boys can, right? And so there are those conversations, and then add in the structurally endemic ways that society teaches women to behave, right? And men. So I think it's really important to have the conversation. And Bell Hooks talks about this. Patriarchy hurts all of us, men, any men and women, no matter how you identify. It hurts all of us. Boys are raised in a world where they are expected to behave a certain way. They are not allowed to show emotion. They don't talk about going to therapy. They don't even go to the doctor as often. That's why men die at a younger age, because they aren't getting social support, mental health support, and they don't go to physicians at the same rate. Then add color on there.
Yeah.
Add brown onto that.
Yeah.
And men are that's why we know men of color die sooner than any other race. So really understanding that the system is set up in a way that is harming everyone. And if we can get both men and women on the same page about that, rather than it being a us versus them, woman versus men, it really needs to be a we conversation.
Yeah.
How do we support the growth and development of our children so that they see that there is equality and that they're supported in that? So I think it's certainly trickier.
Yeah.
In cultures where there is already a suggestion. I grew up Catholic.
Yeah.
And so certainly not the same, but there was certainly an experience of I needed to follow the rules all the time, whatever those rules were. And if I didn't, I was disrespectful. And I'm sure that's part of the issue here, right? Is that
it's very similar. It's very similar in South Asian cultures.
Societal norms.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And so, and then if you're perceived as disrespectful, like if you do something against the religion or against the family, then it's a shame, a huge, significant shaming, right? And so I think it's important to understand that, of course, culture is so vital to our existence. The reason why I teach sociology in addition to social work, but the reason why we hold on to our culture is because it actually is an identifier for us.
Yeah.
So we don't want people to feel like they need to let go of their culture in order to understand coercive control. I think it's really important. But are you being treated with malicious intent? That's the question. Is someone not letting you go out at all to see loved ones? Or are they worried about you going out at night alone? There's a difference.
Yeah, there's a difference.
There's a difference there. Is someone telling you, ask yourself, that they don't want you to hang out with your friends because they don't like your friends? And in your heart, do you know these people add value to your life? And so if people add value to our life and someone is suggesting they shouldn't be a part of our life, we have to ask the question, why?
Yeah.
Is it because they're threatened by that person? Because coercive controllers, narcissistic abusers are threatened by others in our life?
Yes.
Is it because they don't want our life enhanced? If someone's enhancing our life, our loved ones should appreciate that. What about our career?
Yeah.
Is our career something that we love and we get so much joy out of? And this person, again, is threatened by that, does not want to see us moving up the ranks in our career, doesn't feel comfortable with that. And so asking yourself, is there malicious intent? Is this about them? Or is it about you? And is it about the cultural norms about safety? Right?
Yeah. But Christine, like malicious intent is so
Nuanced.
yeah. And it's also one of those things that's, I feel like it's so hard to believe or come to terms with the fact that there could be malicious intent. And then if it's done covertly, so if it's not done in a way where it's like, oh, you can never see your friends or don't have any friends, isn't it one of those tricky things that's so hard to spot? That is maybe, like, in my understanding, like maybe that's the one aspect that makes you blind to when it's happening to you.
I would say absolutely. And I would say, again, going back to my experiences, I had been teaching on this topic every single semester. I had been a therapist. Yeah. I've been doing this work since the age of 19. And I stayed with the person for I was counting last night, 28 years, 11 months. And that's not including 7 years of dating.
Wow.
When you're very young and you don't know red and green flags, and then you're engaged with someone, and then you're in that relationship now, right? And so I wasn't allowed to date. Yeah. And then I met a boy, and then...
It's like you were raised in Pakistan.
Right, yeah. Right. So 16 years old, still had not really dated. Yes. And so in that, I was perfect prey, right, for someone who could be abusive. And so, but it didn't get, to your point, the malicious overt intent was not evident for many, many years. And maybe if I look back, there were signs, but when you're in it, you don't see it, to your point, okay? And so we need to listen to our bodies. I can't say that. I cannot say that more strongly. Yeah. We are all having somatic experiences. My just saying that gave me goosebumps.
Yeah.
What does
Can you say a little bit about what your body was saying that you were not listening to?
Sure. So I knew that there was a push-pull. I knew that something didn't feel right sometimes. But going back to Biderman, think about this. Prisoners of war who had basically denied doing anything against the communist country were worn down, grown men, worn down so much that they eventually acquiesced and even admitted to doing something wrong that they hadn't done. Mm-hmm. So I think what's really important, and you started the conversation by asking about like emotional abuse and what's the difference in all of these. I think it's really important to understand that this impacts our psyche, and that's why I call it psychological abuse, because our brain actually changes in these relationships. There is actually a neurological change occurring in your brain. Your hippocampus changes. Cortisol levels are back and forth. And so if that's happening in our brain, our body is feeling it. Yeah. And so really what happens with these abusers is they gaslight us over and over. But because of that, and think about growing up in the family systems that maybe it sounds like I may have grown up similarly, certainly maybe not to the same extent. Yeah. But ask yourself, did your parents make you diminish your intuition? Did they tell you that something was right even though maybe your body didn't feel it was right? And we did that out of respect for people in our family. Perhaps you were meant to go say hi to an aunt or uncle that really didn't make you feel comfortable. And so we teach our children, we actually diminish their intuition. I call it intuition disintegration, where it literally gets broken down. And it's not gaslighting, because gaslighting has malicious intent. So ask yourself, in this relationship, are you listening to your body? And what is your body telling you when that person says, no, I don't want you going out tonight? Is your body telling you that is them trying to control you or to coerce you to feel a certain way? Or is that because there is this system in this culture where they are doing what a man is supposedly supposed to do in this culture, which I think is much trickier in this culture.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There you have a whole nother layer.
Yeah. But Christine, how did you go from not knowing that this is happening in your relationship to kind of knowing and then believing, the way you do today, that there was malicious intent? Because that's just such a big jump.
It is.
Yeah.
And it takes such a long time for you to, come to those realizations, being more aware of the malicious intent.
Absolutely. So I think it's really important to highlight some words. Okay. So if someone is trying to make you not believe your reality, if they tell you something is different than your reality, they're gaslighting you. And understanding what gaslighting is very important, because that's what these abusers often do. So your listeners should be educating themselves on how to really determine if something is gaslighting or not, and ask themselves. And so I'll go back. I think it's really important to begin journaling. I call it a re-traumatization list.
Okay.
I think Dr. Ramani calls it an icky list. So the idea is to write down things that are happening in the relationship, and write down, okay, so today I was told I could not go out with my girlfriends. And then write down how you felt about it. Right. And then write down what you believe the person's intent was. Was it safety? Or was it to prevent you from having a good time? Or was it because it was going to be at night? And that might be a safety. Ask yourself, but really begin writing down how these things are occurring. Let's say your partner calls you a name. Well, first of all, name calling right away is abuse.
Yeah, labeled, right?
Verbal assaults are abuse, and they are overt. Yeah. So ask yourself, am I being called names?
Yeah.
Am I being stonewalled?
Yeah.
When I ask my partner why they made a certain decision or why they feel a certain way, do they ignore? Or if I go out with girlfriends and when I come home, they aren't talking with me, that is stonewalling. That is abuse. Is there contempt? Does the person treat me with a disregard? Are they trying to diminish me as a mother, a partner, a friend in the home? Do they tell me that my friends don't like me? And I know my friends like me. So these are all of the things that we really want to be thinking about. But I think it's really important when we're writing this list. And I would do it, if you're questioning yourself, you need to do this list every single day. And the reason why I call it a re-traumatization list is because we actually are opening our eyes to the trauma, but then when things are good. So the thing about what Biderman found is that the way to erode people's autonomy, their agency, is to also give them something good to hold on to.
Okay.
So your partner tells you you can't go out and you're upset and you know it doesn't feel right, and you've written down how your body feels. This did not feel good in my body. I'm not comfortable with this decision. I wish he didn't make that decision. But then the next day, he comes home and he has breakfast for you. Or he makes you breakfast and he hasn't made you breakfast in a while. Or every day he makes you breakfast, but he stonewalled you for a couple of days. But today he made you breakfast again. And that is called intermittent reinforcement. And the brain actually has a neurological response to it. It's called oxytocin, is the cuddle hormone. And our body responds to it, and all of a sudden, it's almost like we melt. We're not mad anymore.
Yeah.
Or we don't feel that negative feeling in our body anymore. We're like, oh, he does love me. Or he didn't mean to have malicious intent.
I know, but Christine, how intentional do you feel this is? Like this kind of behavior from the abuser, where there is this intermittent reinforcement. So there is like stonewalling, and then there's breakfast. Is this just unconsciously happening
By them?
by them?
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that what we have to understand is the pathology of them needs to retain control. They don't say, I'm going to stonewall her. They say, I'm angry with her, and I'm not going to talk to her, and I'm going to punish her. That's what it's really about. How do I punish her and make her feel discomfort? And so is it a conscious effort to punish? Yes. Do they know that it is wrong to be punishing? Most likely no. Most often no.
So there is an element of like unconsciousness in how they're operating.
I believe there is. I believe it becomes so natural to cover that shame. This is, again, it goes back to their childhood shame. And it becomes so natural for them to cover that shame that it now is just like you and I being nice to someone. Is it conscious for you to be nice, or do you just unconsciously try your best to be kind to someone?
Yeah. Okay. And on that note, I'm just going to go a little bit farther on trauma bonding.
Yes.
So I think in theory, it's easy to understand, like it's intermittent reinforcement, right? So it's like good, bad, back and forth.
Yeah.
But eventually less good
And
and a lot more bad.
a lot more bad.
Right.
But somewhere, I feel like when people talk about trauma bonding, there is also a connection, and you correct me when how you see it, but I feel like there's a connection in the abuser's inner wounded child. It's like you've actually formed a bond with an unconscious part of them that maybe they're not even connected to. And the empathic floodgates are big, and it's just so much harder to break that trauma bond than recognizing patterns.
I agree.
Yeah.
So a trauma bond is it's like cocaine on the brain.
Yeah.
And so it is like an addiction, but there's no rehab for it.
Yeah.
So that re-traumatization, that's why I call it a re-traumatization list, because we know that victims and survivors go back to their abusers on average 7 attempts. I went back 5 times.
Yeah.
The reality is that it is very challenging to leave that, especially when they're pulling you back in, and there is that positive. And so I would say that looking at the list and reminding you of the bad is traumatizing, but that is the way to begin to break the trauma bond. And there's no shame in going back, and there is absolutely no shame for people who decide to stay, because this is the hardest thing anyone will ever do. Yeah. There is no rehab for this.
Yeah.
There is only support in conversations like this. Yeah. And I think what happens for victims and survivors, I'm going to go back to something that you asked earlier, Jasmyn, but I think what happens to them is that once they kind of think they are a victim, they begin devouring everything to learn more about what their experience is. And in that, there's validation. But the isolation that abusers set people up for, and I think in your culture in particular, so in the United States, one of the things, and in the West, is that there are more people speaking openly. I'm here speaking openly, right? And so there are those conversations happening, but here, there's so much more isolation. I think if I were to say, what is the one thing about your culture that is creating more victims and survivors, it's the ability to isolate.
Yeah. Silence, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And so victims are silenced.
Yeah.
And because of the cultural norms, and what victims need to do is create an alternate email account and download some books. And one of the books that was very helpful for me is John Gottman is a wonderful marriage and family therapist, he and his wife, and their work is astounding. He created the emotional abuse scale. And again, I'm not a fan of emotional abuse because I believe that our emotions are impacted, but our brain also changes. But in any case, that emotional abuse scale is really helpful. But he also has a book. So he teaches therapists how to help people in relationships.
Right. And
some of what he teaches is about how to be a better partner. And the problem is that victims and survivors are already the best partners. So don't look at him for that. But he has a book called The 7 Characteristics of a Highly Effective Marriage. And one of my only good therapists, because I had several that gaslit me, one of my only therapist that was good and who I still see occasionally gave me this book to show me what is unhealthy.
Right.
So if you read the book and you go through the 7 habits of a highly effective marriage, you will say, oh my gosh, I'm missing all of these. And he talks about contempt and stonewalling. And these are really important concepts to understand. He calls it the 4 horsemen. And then I would also say another really great book or an understanding that women in particular in society are subjugated just by being women. And Jeffrey Young has a subjugation questionnaire, And if you go through that subjugation questionnaire, you understand that you are much more attractive to predators in life. And then perhaps a third one that is really helpful, or I would say a third person, is following Dr. Ramani.
Yeah.
Who we had in here yesterday. So
Yes. So I would say, I think I first found Dr. Ramani, and second, or probably Jeffrey Young and the subjugation questionnaire, and then Dr. Ramani, and then the 7 habits of highly effective marriage. And so in that, I was able to begin to really unpack. And then if you are a parent, when you begin to understand that that person is coercively controlling your home,
right,
and that the children are being coercively controlled, even if they love this person, even if this person looks to be like a wonderful parent, they are truly covertly harming the child. And Lundy Bancroft's work, The Batter as Parent, is a wonderful book.
Yeah. Dr. Christine, I wanted to check in with you and see, like you mentioned that there's, people who stay in the marriage, there's no, with a, or in a partnership with a coercive controller, there's no shame there, right? I wonder if there's healing there. Is there a possibility to heal within the relationship?
Sure. So what we know is that victims can live in that relationship with boundaries.
Amen.
And I think what's really important is you have to discern if you can do this safely.
Right.
Because when we begin to put up boundaries with abusers, oftentimes that's when things become, well, we know,
worse.
In over 90% of cases, coercive control intensifies post-separation. So if you're post-separation but in the home, in some ways the abuser knows you're disengaging, that abuser may become worse. And so people often mistake that coercive control does not mean physical violence, and that is incorrect.
Okay.
Physical violence does occur. It just often is not the first thing to occur. Again, all domestic abuse is based on coercive control. The person wants to control you first, and when they can't control you anymore, they will move to other ways to control you, including physical violence. Right. Over 94% of the murders in a study recently in the UK, the woman had suffered, that the investigators were aware of, coercive control. We have to assume that when a woman is murdered or children are murdered, that is about someone trying to exert power and control over them. And so you have to assess whether or not you would be safe. I think I always say we kind of fake it till we make it. There was a period of time that I knew my marriage wasn't healthy, but I was staying for the children, and he didn't even know that I knew the marriage wasn't healthy. But then eventually I could no longer hold the facade. And that's when things did get worse. So I think what victims need to know is, how do they create boundaries and call out behavior? You can say to someone, again, if you think you can do so safely, I don't appreciate being called names.
Right.
And I think it's really important as therapists, we need to understand the best ways to communicate. We never use the word you. Like, you shouldn't call me a bad name.
Yeah.
Can put someone on the defense.
Yes.
And not that a perpetrator wouldn't be on the defense, but it's better to use I statements.
Yeah.
I don't appreciate being called names, and let the children hear that. Yeah. So that they learn that you are creating boundaries. Or, I'm sorry you don't think I should be able to go out tonight, but I am going out tonight. And let the children see you having agency, creating your own framework of your own boundaries.
Yeah.
And so I think it's hard. And I think that oftentimes, again, this abuser might elevate. What victims need to understand, and I'm assuming Dr. Ramani talked about this, is that we become so important to that abuser because we are supplying them.
Yeah, the supply. And if the supply gets, in some ways, there's a lack of, it would trigger.
It triggers it.
Yeah.
That's right. And then oftentimes that's when they will begin more overtly engaging the children and saying to the children things like, your mother doesn't love me, or your mother doesn't love you.
But Christine, can you give us a covert example of how the children are being manipulated or controlled when it's very hidden?
Sure. So I would, for example, let's say a child wants to watch a TV show and it's time for bed. and mom says, it's time for bed. And dad says, you don't have to go to bed. You can just sit here and watch the TV show with me. That doesn't feel overt, but it doesn't feel covert, but it actually is, because it's not very mean. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Or outside, the child will hear from the other parent, the abuser, Mom yells a lot, doesn't she? Or, wow, I can't believe Mom wore that outfit. I wonder why Mom wore that outfit. It may not even feel mean or malicious, but it's an undermining of that parent. It's a way to make that parent not seem like they're stable. Or, gosh, I wish Mom would take her medications. I wonder why she's not. Or, I wonder why Mom didn't do her hair today. It's these little drops planting seeds of betrayal, of making the child feel unsafe with that parent, that they're not trustworthy.
Yeah. Like they kind of make them question the other parent.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I know, Christine, like in following your work, you talk about how these abusive people are highly like litigious people, right? Like they will go to court for custody. And there's an element, would you say there's an element beyond a healthy level of ownership over the children? So I know as a parent, you're the guardian, but there is a level of autonomy that in your mind you experience that your child has just as a human, and the right to both parents and the right to various relationships. Whereas these abusive people will often go to a place of just wanting complete control over the kids.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they weaponize the children. So they know what matters most to the protective parent, and they weaponize. And I would ask your listeners to ask this question. If someone was being physically violent to you, you would call it abuse.
Yeah.
Yet oftentimes when the abuse is more covert, we don't call it abuse, and it is. If this abuser is covertly abusing your children and is not a good parent, that is abuse. Even though there is not physical violence, even though they seem to be fun and your child's having a great time with them, your children are learning they cannot be authentically themselves with that abuser. The only way the abuser loves them is the same way that the abuser loves you, is if you do what is required. That's why they love you. If you follow the rules. And children, of all things, due to the developing brain, need to know that they're loved no matter what they do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there hope for healing in the abuser? Is it on a spectrum? If there's hope, what do we look for? How do we know?
Sure. So I would say that if someone is undermining you as a parent or a person, even if you don't have children, they have malicious intent. And in that, there really isn't hope for these traits to change. Remember, they started very early on, and these traits cannot change. Are there people who maybe, again, low level can change? But we're not talking about low level. When someone is undermining you as a human being, is making you feel less than you are. And again, feel that in your body. Know who you are. Ask yourself, do I even know who I am anymore? Because if you've lost yourself, that was the goal. And so anybody who would do that is not a good person, and they cannot change. And it is not our job, by the way, to make someone change.
Okay, so very little hope there.
I would say no hope.
Okay.
Because my worry is that victims and survivors hold on to hope all the time.
Yeah.
Highly optimistic. The glass is half full. Do not be optimistic. Be realistic. I talk about radical acceptance in a program I run for protective parents. We have to radically accept they are who they are. And the issue becomes is that victims and survivors are typically not the type of people, again, that see that there could be that much bad in the world. There is evil in the world. There are bad people. It just so happens this bad person found you, not because there's anything wrong with you, because there's everything right with you.
Yeah.
Powerful.
Yeah.
We didn't get a chance to talk so much about post-separation abuse, which is one thing that I was really like mind-blowing for me with your work. It's just something we don't talk about in the world. Does that ever end?
So sometimes when abusers move on to other victims, it can end. Sometimes the other victim actually becomes a participant in the post-separation abuse. And so I think there's a couple of ways it can end. First of all, victims and survivors need to disengage as much as possible with the abuser. I had a folder called Freedom. And every time I would get a horrific email, it went right into the Freedom folder. And occasionally I would look at them just to remind myself, because of the trauma bonding, how awful this person was. And so really disengaging, I think, not texting, but email, so that you have a space where you're not always seeing these things. That's really important in post-separation and during. Even if you haven't separated, sometimes that's important. No more phone calls. No more verbal assaults, because your body, again, thinking about what your body is going through. If we think about how much our body goes through physically with pain, your brain is going through those things physiologically with pain. And our brain doesn't need to have that pain. It's not healthy for us. Trauma creates all kinds of physical responses in our body. Remember that. So there is that. I think that also, so the disengagement is important. And I think reminding yourself that this is something that may go on and planning for that. I always tell victims, use the 3 Ps. Predict that it's going to continue. Prepare yourself. Fortify yourself. I had a mom yesterday ask me this identical question. I said, and she has to take phone calls per the court.
Yeah.
So I said, time them on your phone. Decide if it's going to be a 3-minute call, a 5-minute call, a 7-minute call. Limit them to once a week or twice a week. Fortify yourself before. Do something in self-care before, and immediately following, hang up that phone and immediately take care of yourself and engage in self-care. And then in that, hopefully, you're not going to have the same physiological responses going on in your body and neurologically in your brain, so that you're protecting yourself. Yeah. So when the children are when they're over 18, some children entirely disengage from these abusers. And let me just say, that is actually ideal.
Right.
That person, if he was physically assaulting them, you would never want your children around them again.
Yeah.
If he's not, it's the same situation.
Right.
So that's ideal. Or your children are with boundaries and you've taught them in your home. I always say protective parents are the therapists in the home. You have the ability to give your children clarity between your house and that house, if you're living with them, between your parenting and their parenting. And so your children hopefully have a relationship, if at all, with boundaries, that they have their own agency, that they're able to protect themselves. And in that, you have less engagement with that abuser.
Yeah. Okay. So really, it's the children that keep the abuse going on until that decreases.
Yes.
But okay, thank you so much, Christine. I mean, I just think we have so much to learn, just not as a society, like in the world, about this. And I hope we can have you on again and get into more detail on some of these aspects.
Yeah, these were wonderful tools that, sharing with our audience, which hopefully will be helpful to victims and survivors. Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me here. I would love to come back anytime. So
thank you.
Thank you.